Hyler, who both of which are very passionate about writing across the curriculum, especially with science, which is what our focus is going to be for tonight. They typically do a science project with Beaver Island, as well as some work with salmon. And the kids get a lot out of it. And I've heard them talk about this project in detail before, and it just wows me every single time. So without further ado, I am going to give it to Jeremy and Troy. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Hyler. To give you a little bit of background for me, I teach in a rural school district. We have in our middle school, high school, there's approximately 600 students, maybe 500 to 600 students. Middle school, we have about 100 and I say about 140 students in our middle school, maybe a little bit less than that. So very small. I am literally out in the middle of a cornfield, so surrounded by cornfields. Right now, I'm currently teaching 6th grade English and 7th grade science, and I teach an 8th grade advisory class as well. So that's kind of what my day looks like. Yes, I'm teaching face-to-face, but also I have some hybrid kids, so some kids that are online, so you kind of have an idea of where I'm coming from. We have been face-to-face all year, and we have had hybrid kids. What's really funny is that it seems like middle school kids always have excessive attendance because as the year has progressed, we've had more parents sending their kids back face to face. And we've only had about a 6-week stint where we were online during that big peak we had in November, which was really across the whole United States. So, but as Becky said, I'm also a teacher consultant for the Writing Project. Wear some different hats, NCTE. I'm a community ambassador there. I'm also a media literacy innovator for KQED, so kind of all over the place. And so, yeah, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Hicks and let him introduce himself.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, you're always so formal when you do that. I really appreciate it. So I'm Troy Hicks. I'm the director of the Chippewa River Writing Project. Had the good fortune of working with Jeremy now since 2010 in a variety of iterations. And much of what we're going to talk about tonight comes out of some of the work that he's done with another one of our, I don't call it, he's not officially a Writing Project TC, but he's definitely a friend of the Writing Project, Jeremy Windsor. So we talk about the Jeremies. And so if you hear us tonight either say the Jeremies or you hear Windsor or Hyler, that's what that is all making sense of. And so Jeremy Hyler and I have had the good fortune of collaborating on a couple of different book projects, the most recent of which is Ask, Explore, and Write, published by Routledge and Ion Education. And what I will do is drop a link to the book companion site in the chat so you can go and find some of these resources. So when you land on Jeremy's page and you hover over that Ask, Explore, Write menu, you'll have links to the individual chapters. So not only will you see these things in the slide deck, but you'll also see them off the companion page. The other person I want to give a shout out to before we get moving is our co-author on the book and also someone who we've collaborated with as we've made trips to Beaver Island, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. And that is Willeen Pangle. She is a professor of biology at Central Michigan University and has been very instrumental in getting us kind of moving along. So yeah, there again is Jeremy's website. I think that little screenshot is also a hyperlink out of the slide deck, if I'm recalling correctly. So you have that in the chat, you have it there. And again, we tried to make as many of these resources available to you on the website as possible. Jeremy, am I forgetting anything before I kind of launch into that opening quote?
I don't think so, sir. I think we're all set. So I think you covered it very well.
All right, fantastic. So yeah, let's look at this really quickly. And Jeremy and I kind of joke, like I do the intro and I do the conclusion, and then it's a lot of Jeremy in the middle of this. So you're only going to have to listen to me for just a few more minutes. But as the three of us were composing this book, we've all had various experiences with whether you want to call it writing to learn, writing in the disciplines, writing across the curriculum, disciplinary literacy. there are so many things that we've all been on these educational bandwagons so many times. It's hard to remember which one is which. But the one thing that we really kept coming back to over and over again is we met every week and we would write and we'd revise and we'd share chapters with our editor and then we'd write some more. Is this idea that we began that right with the assumption that writing is an integral part of science and that we only understand the world through language, and we only understand the discipline of science through language. And Wileen was so good about helping us see the ways in which she, as a scientist, often uses language in critical and creative ways. And so you're going to see a lot of that infused in the different types of activities we described tonight. We are going to share just a brief little bit about our Beaver Island Institute. We actually have one of our participants from Beaver Island here. We might have her take the microphone in just a moment. But Mr. Hyler, do you want to share a few words about the Institute that we've been able to do, not recently, but again soon on Beaver Island?
Yes, it will be coming back. But as all of you know, COVID put a restriction on a lot of things over the last couple of years. But Beaver Island has been, again, because it's related to the writing project, has been one of the greatest professional developments that I've ever been a part of. And I've been blessed to be able to be part of that leadership team in the other years as we've been planning this and doing it. And we get to take a week and go up to Beaver Island at the CMU Biological Station. And it's been geared more towards middle school and high school teachers. And during that week, middle school and high school teachers are doing a lot of this inquiry-based learning, and they're doing a lot of different activities, and it's hands-on activities, whether we are going and looking at snakes underneath the snake boards, or whether we are going to the shoreline to the beach and doing lines of transect and doing different things, or doing the microinvertebrate lab where we're going into the creeks and kicking the net, doing the kick nets and picking up micro and macroinvertebrates and bringing them back to the lab and studying them and seeing them. But ultimately, what we wanted participants to be able to do in the week that they're there is to come up with a lesson plan or a unit plan, something that they can take back to their classroom and to their schools to be able to use. And we've also asked that when participants come up, they come up with a team member. So it's always like an English teacher and a science teacher to get that literacy component and to come up with that inquiry-based literacy type lesson or unit to take back into the classroom. So I don't know if that did it justice, Troy, but that's the takeaway for me. And it's a great experience, and it's beautiful up there. And there's nothing to compare to it. It's my workcation that I always call it.
Definitely. And I don't want to put our colleague on the spot to be captured for posterity, but if she'd like to jump in, we'll both stop talking for a moment, let her take the mic.
So I have to agree with Jeremy that it is definitely it's the best professional development vacation / beautiful, like all of those things rolled into one. It definitely reminds, at least because my background is science, so it definitely reminds me of how much and how critical being out in the field and getting to actually do science really is, and how important it is for our kids. Kind of rekindles that excitement about that inquiry piece. So yeah, if and when it comes back, I would highly recommend it for sure.
Thanks so much, Karen. Yeah. And we do hope to bring it back eventually. We do hope to get back to Beaver Island. We're still kind of in that nebulous, hopefully post-pandemic stage with the restrictions on the island and vaccines and everything. And we just decided to kind of put a pause on it this year. But last thing I'll say before I really do turn this over to Jeremy for a while is on slide 7, there's a link to a YouTube video. It's a promotional video we made from 2019, kind of describing the Institute and what happens on the island. It's about 6 minutes long, and we're not going to take the time to do that right now during our webinar. But if you'd like to check that out at some point, it is there in the shared slide deck. So do take a look at it and keep your eye on our website for more information about the Beaver Island Institute, hopefully coming back in 2022. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy for a few minutes and let him kind of jump in and share some of the tools and techniques and strategies that he uses. And then as we get to the second part of the webinar, I'm going to share an activity that I've kind of modified and developed and used at Beaver Island and other spaces too. But for now, I'm going to turn it back to Jeremy and let you take it away.
Thank you, Troy. So tonight, what I would, Troy and I were hoping to focus on is a couple different things. I wanted to talk about infographics and notebooks. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the notebook part because Becky did a really awesome job with her presentation on notebooks. And it really just kind of carries over into the science world. So I'll show you a couple of examples of how I do some things with science notebooks and show you some student examples. But really, if you want to know particularly about like virtual notebooks, go back and watch the recording of when Becky presented because it was an awesome presentation and it's very, very helpful. And then Troy's going to talk about this lesson that he does up on the island with creative nonfiction, which is another phenomenal lesson. And these things can be found in the book. And we're not here to promote the book, but if you want more detail and you want to read into it, I would recommend that you look at the book or look at my website for more detailed information. So I'm going to start off tonight by talking to you about infographics because this is something that has been very helpful, not only to me in the classroom prior to the pandemic, but also during the pandemic as well, because it was a really great activity to do with students during the pandemic and have students share online and have them go into breakout rooms and talk about building an infographic. So I think this will be very helpful to you. First of all, the question of what is an infographic, and this comes from my middle web blog post. It's just a visual representation of data where we try to display some information. It's filled with graphics. It's filled with words and numbers and different things. And it's not like reading a paragraph, but it's a visual representation that is appealing. Colors are usually chosen on purpose and pictures are chosen on purpose for whatever it is that the information the infographic is trying to get across to the reader. It's one of the things that I try to get across to my students is that when you are creating an infographic, make sure that you are creating an infographic that is not busy. We want to make it try to be as simple as possible. And the reason why I reference my middle web blog post is because that is referring to a lesson on infographics that I did during the pandemic. So there's a link there if you have access to the presentation, which I know Becky's been shipping out. So thank you very much for sending that into the chat. And I'm going to keep it in this mode. I don't like to do presentation mode because it's just easier to read and it's more appealing, I think, to people during this. But take a look at that middle web blog post if you get a chance. So the why, I always like to try to answer the why when I'm talking to teachers, other teachers. It is really about building that literacy skill because one of the common things that we see with students is they leave the English classroom and they're like, I don't have to worry about grammar. I don't have to worry about spelling or capital letters or things like that. Well, yeah, you do. So you have to worry about that in all subject areas, not just science, but you also have to worry about social studies and math as well. And then we all know that science is math applied. And so we're trying to build those numeracy skills as well in science and making sure that students are able to carry those skills across the curriculum in science, not just in math. But it also helps students to evaluate and synthesize data. I think one of the things that particularly now in an era when there is misinformation that's out there, I think we really have to help students to be able to evaluate and have them talk to us about what is it that they're seeing, what messages is an infographic trying to display, or what is the message that you are ultimately trying to give to people when you create a infographic. And I do talk with my students about, yes, there are infographics out there that are meant to be misleading. So you have to be careful in terms of evaluating and synthesizing that data. I like to use infographics for both formative and summative assessments, more for the formative assessment in terms of just getting a quick pulse on what is it that they know. So maybe the last 15 minutes of class, I might say, all right, this would be after they already know about infographics and how to create them. Okay, so go in to Canva or go into Visme, which are two tools we'll talk about a little bit later. Go in, create that infographic real quick and share it with me. You've got 15 minutes, go. And then I can kind of evaluate a little bit on how they're doing. More of a summative assessment, this could take place, especially in the time of a pandemic, if you are still teaching online 100% and you want students to do something more than just a Google form test. This could be a way to measure what they know in your classroom or what they know in a unit that you're teaching. We know that infographics can be displayed for a wider audience. We see them in blog posts, we see them in social media, Facebook, Twitter, we see them all over the place. And so we could offer that to students to have that bigger audience for them instead of, a test. A test is not going to, your principal or your parents not necessarily going to read, a test and say, oh, look at those questions that were on that test. That's great. They're just not going to do that. And then it just gives an opportunity for them to get additional writing opportunities in the science classroom. And they're not writing opportunities that are like this long essay. It's just a writing opportunity where they can plop these really quick writing points onto their infographic. So that's why I like to use them in my classroom. So I'd like to direct our attention to how I introduce infographics to my students. One of the first things I do is obviously just what I did with you. I give them the definition of what an infographic is. And then what I typically do is I just have them go to Google, because we are a one-to-one classroom or school. I will have them just type in the term infographic, and I'll have them do a Google search, and I'll have them do that underneath images. And so they can get to see all the different infographics that are available. And then once they see them, the light bulb clicks on. They're like, oh yeah, I've seen those before. I know what those are, Mr. Hyler. And so then we start to break it down a little bit further, and I start to look at different questions to have them answer to me. So we would look at the infographic that I just presented to you, and I'm going to have you do this in a minute, but I would have them look at what is the title of that graph. Okay, so what are some of the pictures that you're seeing? What kinds of shapes are you seeing in that graph? Could you summarize in 1 or 2 sentences, like a Twitter bite-sized piece of information? If I had you raise your hand, what could you tell me that infographic is about? What kind of statistics are you seeing in that graph? Who was the one that put that graph out? So what was the source of it? What is your opinion of that graph? And so we start here, all right? And typically I will have students record this in their science notebooks, which we'll get to later, or we might just have a discussion in class. I like the idea of putting it into their science notebooks because that forces them to actually do something and to look at the graph instead of, especially when they're online, instead of just saying, hey, I need you to look at this graph. We're going to answer some questions. And then they wander off and they don't do something, they're on a different website. So, and then I think the most important question that we need to ask students is, how does it relate to you? This information that you're seeing in this graph, how does it relate to you or the world around you? When we can make those connections with students, then they're more apt to be involved in what it is that we're doing in our classroom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to take a look at this graph, and you can click on in slide 14. If you click on the picture, a link will pop up to this graph, so it's a little bit bigger. And what you'll see is you'll see it here in Flickr, and you can zoom in on it to make it a little bit bigger. But I want you to just take a few minutes, and I want you to look at that graph. And then I'm going to ask some questions, those questions that were on the slide prior to this. And you can put those questions in the chat, or you can take the mic and you can answer them. So let's just take a few minutes and look at this particular graph or infographic. Thank you, Tracy, for putting that in there. Okay, so just for the sake of time, I want to make sure we can get through everything tonight. Going back to slide 13 on the presentation, just looking at those different bullet points, does anybody want to either say out loud or put into the chat, what is the title of our graph that we have here, this infographic that we have?
So the title is Bringing the Farm to School, Growing Healthy Children and Communities.
Okay. Yep. So Megan and Kyle had said the same thing. So, and you know, I would, if a student said to me, Mr. Hyler, well, I don't know where the title is at. Well, then, you know, obviously we could, you know, point it out. Hey, here's the title of it right here at the top. It says Bringing the Farm to School. And there's a little subtitle there too, Growing Healthy Children and Communities. So, because, you know, you always get those students who are like, I don't see where the title's at. Well, it's right there. So, so describe the picture. Anybody want to just take a few words in the chat, or anybody want to take the mic and say, what kind of pictures are you seeing? What kind of shapes in the graph are you seeing? You know, how is the graph laid out? Maybe would be a better question you could ask students. Don't be shy. You can take that mic if you want. Kyle says square, moves from top to bottom. Very good. Any other thoughts here?
It does exactly what the title says it does, bringing the farm to school with the road. Starts at a farm and then ends at the school at the front.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good. So thank you. Yeah, hopefully you were able to catch that. And what's funny is that students won't catch that because they're so infatuated with the fact of, you know, even when I first looked at this graph, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm like, that's a funny picture. Look at the cows in the background. They're saying that's a lot of money, a lot of lunch money, you know, so I might pay attention to those types of things instead of actually looking at the fact that it does lead to a road or to the school. The road leads to the school. Anna says it almost looks like a magazine cover. The grocery bags show percentages and have pictures of what it is in the bags. So yeah, very good point. Very good point. Okay. So another question I would ask students, we won't summarize the information given in the graph, but where did this graph come from? I'm just going to kind of skip down here. Where did this graph come from? Where's the source of this graph? What is the source of this graph? Yep, USDA. So I would ask a follow-up question with my students. Is this a reliable resource or a reliable source? Tracy says your tax money. Yes, not untrue. So is this a reliable resource or reliable source? That's what I would ask students as a follow-up question. And I'm going to ask you that same question. Is the USDA a reliable source? Karen says we would hope so. Kyle says the same thing. And Tracy says it depends on who's president. So very true, very true. So, so this is where I think a really good conversation can take place, whether you are virtual or whether you are face-to-face with your students. But and you could also push students into breakout rooms in terms of this last question that I'll ask. And that is, what is your opinion of the results that you see on this infographic? So what is your opinion of all this? Do you believe it? Do you think it's true? Do you think it's over-exaggerated? Okay, and Kyle's pointing out that the information is gathered in the bottom left-hand corner. So what is your opinion of this graph? Do you that you have, or do you have an opinion about this graph? Feel free to use the chat or take the mic.
Okay, I can talk faster than I can type.
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
So I think one of the things that was most surprising to me, and maybe it's just because of where my school district is in a kind of a suburban area, when it says 56% of schools say they will buy more local food in the future. I wonder, and maybe this is my adult cynicism or skepticism, will they do that if it costs more? Will they do that if they're not being subsidized by grant dollars or government dollars? So it leads me to think of some other things, like I would hope that all of this information would be accurate, but how accurate is my question.
Yes, yes. I think that's a very good point. And Carrie had kind of brought up the same point. She's like, I'm guessing that despite what they say, 56% of schools are not buying local. So and I think that cost plays a big, huge part of this, and these are conversations that we want to have with our students, because, I'm in the same situation as you are, Karen, with being in a rural school district, and we have farms all around us, and I don't ever hear our school talking about buying local. I continually see the Gordon food truck service come in to the school. So I don't think that's local. Oh, and Becky asked a really good question too. Is there a political message that's being sent here? That's a legitimate question. So you can kind of see how, you could have these conversations with students, and you could spend an entire class period just on them studying infographics and them breaking them down. And then once you get them to understand the idea behind an infographic, then you can move into this idea of, all right, now we're going to create an infographic. And we're going to look at this next slide that I have is looking at comparing what is the difference. And that's what this deeper dive is, with creating tables and other graphs. So, what does a line graph do? What does a pie graph do? What does a bar graph do? A table, and are these things that can actually go into an infographic? Because I've seen bar graphs in infographics, which I'm sure all of you have, or a pie graph in there. So this table just kind of lays out what are the advantages of looking at these different types of graphs, and then what are some of the teaching points. And I'm not going to get into all of that just for the sake of time. But from here, after having this conversations with students that we just had, and then having them dive a little bit deeper into the different types of graphs, because that's one of the things that as scientists and as science teachers, we want our students to be able to do. We want them to be able to effectively read graphs and be able to pick out what is the message. And so when we turn the tables on our students and say, okay, now it's time for you to go create one, we want to make sure that their message is clear too. And so not that I want to fast forward through things, but to give you some tools. Here are some tools that you could use to create some infographics. And I would highly recommend things like Visme. Pictochart is another one that's a really good one to use. And I think that Karen, when you were on the island, I'm not sure if you can recall what one you use, because I think you guys use an infographic with yours, and I'm not sure what tool you use. So maybe you could even talk about what you found easy to use, not to put you on the spot, but if you wanted to take a minute and just talk about what you used.
Yeah, I used Pictochart and jumped in, like not ever having used any kind of infographic kind of app or program, and found it to be pretty user friendly, like very click and drag, click and drop. So it was easy to use. I've had some students when I've done this with infographics that have had beautiful infographics that they've done with Infogram, and they've found that easy to use. So those are the two that I'm most familiar with.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing, Karen. The other one that's not on here too is Canva. Canva is another really great place where you can go and create infographics as well. And all of these are like what I think I always use Troy's terms, they're freemiums, where you get some stuff that's free, but then if you want the really advanced stuff, you got to pay a price to get to the advanced stuff. But there's all sorts of different links there that you can go and check those out. So just to keep things moving, here is, and I know it's not a very good quality picture, but this was an infographic using Infogram that a student back in 2017 created during our Salmon in the Classroom project that we use, where they were able to use the fish population. We have members of the Department of Water and Quality come out. Environmental Quality, DEQ, comes out, and they actually do some shocking of the creek where we return our salmon. And so the students get to study the fish population. So they created this infographic, learned that there was 19 different species that they pulled out of the creek that day. And you can't see it, but if you actually went into this infogram, you could click, it'll actually pop up. So when you hover over a part of that circle, it'll pop up and show you how many of those fish that they actually captured during that gathering of that of those fish. So, and in this particular year, they found out that there was a high concentration of burbot. If you know anything about fish and burbot usually do not come past the 45th parallel. They are more of an up north kind of fish. But there was a high abundance in the creek, so there's been some studies that have been done as to why that might be. This is one that's done with PictoChart. This was, and this is nothing more than just an example from PictoChart, but I chose this one, the clinical trial phases, purposes, and timeline, because I thought this would be a good infographic where you could have students talk about COVID during the time of our pandemic. So this is one example that you could pick out from PictoChart. So there's an example. So to wrap things up, assessing infographics, when I'm actually looking at assessing my students, what is it that I'm looking for with my students? I'm looking for proper data representation, a bar, table, pie chart. Were those things represented? Is the overall visual appeal of the graph, fonts, color, scale that lead to the ease of reading? I'm sure all of you have experienced looking at infographics, been very busy, and my students tend to make them very busy at first. Does the infographic tell an accurate story? We want our students to learn that we are not trying to give misinformation. We're trying to give facts here. And then are there any other forms of media that are used appropriately? Did they embed a video, or did they embed a map like they did on the one infographic that my students did? And then there is a STEM literacy infographic rubric that you can click on, that link there, that can be very helpful to you, and you can just adapt it to your own classroom. So any questions about infographics before I dive into science notebooks at all? Feel free to take the mic or write in the chat. So thank you for putting the links in there.
Jeremy?
Yeah.
About how long does it take you to do this portion of your unit?
Yeah, great question. So we usually take about a day just to talk about infographics. And this year was a little bit different because I was able to piggyback, because I teach a media literacy class. So I was actually able to take my media literacy course and talk about infographics in there. So I didn't take up science class. I would say a good 60 to 70 minutes just to talk about and go through infographics. And then I like to give them about a half of a class period to play with one of the tools, to figure out which tool best fits them as students. And I always give my students 3 choices to play around with. And so I give them about half a class and they have to decide. So in total, in terms of, introducing infographics, letting them play a little bit, and then creating the infographics, I would say give them a good week to do this. And hopefully that helps. Other questions? Just looking in the chat here. Yeah, no problem, Lori. No problem at all. Okay, so let's dive into notebooks. And like I said, I'm not gonna do a huge crash course to go super fast, but I do want to again make the nod to Becky, because she did cover science notebooks, and I want to make sure that I don't want to step on her toes, but I also don't want to be very repetitive either in terms of what we've done in our webinar series. But what I find notebooks, and this is something that Willeen, our other co-author, and I have talked about, but notebooks really are that safe place for practicing writing, and it's personal. And we want the same thing to happen in science as well. And what I always encourage my students to do is take your science notebook with you everywhere. That's easy when you are in a COVID world because it's online. So you could have your cell phone with you, and you could type in your cell phone, or you could type here on a laptop or a Chromebook. So it's very easy to be able to do. So we talked about some main points that we want students to be able to grow from there and show growth in terms of what they've learned in science. If we're doing an experiment, we want them to be able to replicate what real scientists do and be able to keep track of materials and things that they're doing within the experiment. And then also we want them to just make it personal. We want it to be theirs, and we want them to to be able to express how they feel towards certain things when it comes to science. So what I'm going to do is just kind of go through and talk to you about what are some different ways that science notebooks can be used. Here is a paper example, but again, can still be used in a virtual world. One of the ways that we use science notebooks in my classroom is to make observations about the natural world. One of the very first things that I do at the beginning of science class every year, like the very beginning of the year, is we will just take our science notebooks, we'll get them all prepared, and then we'll go outside, and because our school's on a lot of acres and we have farmland around us, we will just walk around the school grounds, take 20, 30 minutes, and I just tell them, write down anything that they see. To be observant, because to be honest with you, I don't think kids are as observant today as they could be, and observing the world around them. What do they see? Birds. What do they see in the trees? What do they see on the ground? Any kind of animals? Grass. What do they notice within the grass? Do they see mud? Whatever that they possibly see. Write down everything they possibly see, and I always encourage them to draw as well. So you don't always have to write down with words, but you could draw things. And that's what this student did, is they were drawing some one of the species of trees that they saw, and then they were also looking at what the cell walls would look like in a microscope there. One of the other things that is to record data, and especially when it comes to doing experiments. We do an experiment at the beginning of the year where students are growing radish seeds, and they get to manipulate one of the variables. And so they manipulate that variable, and they could, instead of using water, they might use Gatorade, or instead of putting a fertilizer in it, they might put glue in it. So they get a choice, they get a chance to try different things. And so they're recording their data in their science notebooks. And this is just an example of a handwritten data that's been recorded. They took a picture, showed what the roots were looking like in their cup and everything else. One of the other things we use science notebooks for is to brainstorm about experimental design or expected results. And that's what this student did. They were writing out their steps of what they think was going to happen. One of the greatest things I think about being a science teacher is allowing students to come up with their experimental design. Like, okay, so here's what you have. Here's the things that you need for your experiment. Come up with what you're going to do in that experiment. Write it out for me. Talk to me about it. Draw pictures. And so this is one of those other ways that science notebooks can be implemented. And then finally, to record notes on readings, lectures, videos, those typical things that, we don't necessarily mention all the time, because, we don't necessarily want them always writing notes down on lectures and things like that, especially middle school. But, if we want students to take notes on tests or test review, quiz review, those types of things, or to keep them engaged in videos, we might do that. There's also another really cool tool called Edpuzzle. You can get them engaged in videos. So that could be very helpful. There's more information for the science notebooks on the website and within the book. But just to show you in terms of virtually, there's a couple things here I wanted to talk to you about. Down here, and I'll share the link with you. But you can see that you can set up a science notebook. I'll share a link with you that can be shared. I got permission to share it, but you can set up a science notebook with tabs, sticky notes, different things, and I can give you the template for that. I'll share that in the chat here in just a minute. And so that's what you see down here in the bottom left-hand corner. And I'm sorry it's not bigger and able to see. I was trying to squeeze it on there. But also how I've set up my science notebooks, just like here, is using Google Slides. And that's how this is all set up, just like Becky had talked about in her presentation with Google Slides. And they have my students have a table of contents, and what I have my students do is their table of contents are divided into units, the different units that we study, and then we break it down a little bit further in their notebooks. But this is one of my students doing the experimental design for our seed lab, and they were talking about definitions of matter versus energy. And then they were setting up different, I just want to show you that they could set up a table very easily in a Google slide. And they set up another table in their Google Slides that was displaying and recording the data that they were taking each day when they were measuring their radish plants, and they were just making general observations. So I'll share that link in just a minute. But like I said, I didn't want to spend a ton of time on notebooks, but I wanted to highlight those 4 main points of why we use notebooks in the science classroom, which I think are very, very important. And it can be done virtually. Becky had first introduced this stuff back in the Summer Institute in the summer. So it was kind of like a no brainer for me. I was like, yeah, I know exactly what I'm going to be doing for science next year, because we're going to be online. I was on the outlook for different resources for creating a science notebook. And this is where I found this. My colleague, Jeremy Windsor, which Troy had said, mentioned his name earlier. He was the one that shared it with me, and he said, yeah, you can share it with anybody you want to. So, and you can create that, use that template and create the science notebook any way that you want to. So I know that was like super fast, but I also want to make sure that I want Troy to get some time to talk about his creating creative nonfiction. But I don't know if there's any questions that you have about the notebook part of science class. Yes, Edpuzzle is great. So, all right, I don't see any questions about science notebooks, Troy.
Can I
Oh,
ask? I'm sorry. I just
go
had one
ahead.
really quickly. Do you have, I'm looking at your screenshot of the student notebook, and I see all kinds of really cool, colorful things in there. And I'm just wondering if you have one you could flip through to show us.
I can try, and I'll let Troy do his spiel. And then what I'll do is I will pull one up, and so that way you can see something that my students have done, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Yep. So Troy, I think you're up, my man.
All right, set to go. Fantastic. So what we'll do, if you move to that next slide for me really quickly, and then I'll have you stop sharing screen. I'll be very fast, and I'll let you do the things in the background. Yep, perfect. And then I'll drop the shared link in the chat here in a moment. So one of the things that I've kind of found value in is this blending of genres and moving back and forth. And many of you are probably aware of scholars and writers like Tom Romano, who do multi-genre research projects. And then there's Sarah Andrew Vaughn and Kathy Fleischer's book about exploring the unfamiliar genre. And I think when we invite students to move across multiple genres, it gives them opportunities not only to be creative, which is important and actually part of the engagement, but it actually helps them deepen their content knowledge. And so we're going to talk a little bit about creative nonfiction. And as if on cue, how perfect tonight that our friend and colleague Tracy Gardner is letting us use her Zoom room, because I have been a huge fan of your Designing Writing Assignments book forever, Tracy. And that link in that slide there will take you to the open access version of Tracy's book. And I think it's especially chapter 4 that really helps us rethink audiences and purposes for different types of genres that I think becomes incredibly important. Actually, Jeremy, if I can have you stay for one more moment, if you could click on slide 30, let's just pull that up. So one of the first times we did this activity was from our first Beaver Island Institute. And we were able to take a look at this idea of blending genres and playing around a little bit. And so we had gone out to do the Dune transect, and we wanted colleagues really in this case, but we wanted our colleagues to just play around with this idea. And that image right there that you see was created by one of our writing project colleagues, Shannon Oswald, who decided to make a real estate ad. And so she had an ad for each section of the dunes. So this is the valley area from, you have the shore and then up by the tree line, and this was the valley. And so then she kind of took, these different elements of the different plant life at the different areas of the dunes, and was able to, create these little real estate ads, which I thought was a lot of fun. So, all right. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for sticking with those for a moment. I know you wanted to do something in the background, so I'll steal screen sharing from you here very quickly. And what I'm going to do is drop a link to that shared document in the chat. And I welcome you to go ahead and land on that, because you are then going to be able to make your own copy of this document and save it to your own Google Drive. And I want to walk you through this, and I think we might even have a little time to play and have some fun with it. We'll see. So When you land on this, you'll either have that little icon up here to like share and save to your own Google Drive, or you can always go to File and make a copy or something to that effect. Becky, is that working from the view only? It's looking good. People are able to access it. Good. All right. Cool. All right. So what I'd like to do is quickly talk you through this lesson. And again, if we have a moment, we'll kind of play with it. So the idea here is that we want students to really be understanding the ins and outs of nonfiction text. And so you can use this as a very nonfiction-y kind of, let's look at text structures, let's look at headings, let's look at captions, let's do all these types of things. And if you were to click on that black bear story, you would see that it is a pretty typical nonfiction type of text. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that. I think most of you know these types of things and you could probably teach it. You have headings, you have captions, you have additional images, you have hyperlinks, you have all the types of nonfiction features that you'd want. What I'd really want students to drill in on then is this idea of finding the facts, and we're going to kind of compare and contrast the way that these facts are presented in different formats. So in particular, and from the Bill Bryson piece that we'll get to in a minute, it's this idea of how bears interact with people. So what you'll see is that under the wonders of copyright and fair use for educational purposes, I have brought over that chunk of the facts from the Black Bear article. And I'd walk students through this process. Now, we won't do this together. We're going to get to the fun stuff, but this is how I would walk through it. I would say, I want you, dear students, to go in, and you might have them turn on suggesting mode so you can see where they're actually entering this information. But you could say, hey, let's look at the facts in each sentence. And you could get into some question about how many facts are presented. Is it the fact that they're usually shy, one fact, and seldom aggressive, another fact? Or does this all kind of count as one fact? It's kind of up to you. I'd probably say it's one fact. And then I'd say, unless feeling threatened, maybe that's another fact. So this question of counting the number of facts is up to you. But I would quite literally have them go in at the end of the sentence and put in the number there. So they're kind of get a map of how many facts are showing up in these two paragraphs. Then I'd want them to highlight, like, what's the most memorable words or phrase that you see in here? Oh, okay, well, maybe they find something that they find that's memorable, and then they'd highlight it. And then they could add a comment about why they think that sentence is memorable. So again, we're not going to belabor this part. You can figure that out. It's a pretty straightforward kind of nonfiction analysis, making sure that they're comprehending and understanding. Then we get to the fun stuff. And the fun stuff comes when we start looking at literary nonfiction. And you have this definition up here from Lee Gutkind. He's kind of the godfather or grandfather of literary nonfiction. You can click in and read that blog post and find out a little bit more about his perspective if you'd like to. We're going to, again, kind of move forward. And you could also check out this little blog post from Dave Hood talking about elements of creative nonfiction. That would probably be good background reading for you, and maybe even have your students look at as you're getting into this. But what I try to do then is contrast, like, oh, let's look at this kind of straight up, very dry, semi-formulaic, punch things through, get through the nonfiction piece. And then let's compare that to what Bill Bryson does. And we don't have time to read the whole of Bill Bryson's piece, although I love reading this section of Bill Bryson's piece. But we're just going to click on the Lit Hub. And again, you could see all of this here. And you can kind of look in and find it. But I'm going to go down to this one part where he talks about what it would be like to encounter the bear. So I'm drawing from this part here. So you have to imagine that students have already gone through the dry nonfiction piece. Then we get here. Now, on your version of this document, if you'd like to do this, you can certainly highlight, where do you see figurative language like simile, metaphor, personification, hyperbole, or just wonderful imagery that Bill Bryson has used. Maybe you even see some humor in there, hyperbole and humor that you want to add. And then I would have you like highlight and comment, and we might have a few of you comment out loud or drop in the chat why you think these things are particularly effective. And then of course, we would have you talk about positioning, how he talks to you as the reader. And the ultimate goal, just so you have a little bit of heads up of where we're going to be in about 5 minutes, you are going to try to write something like Bill Bryson. Let me punch that down to the next page. You are going to try to take some of his sentence ideas and fill in the blanks as if you were doing this yourself, and you would be thinking about your own animal. So if we had time and I was teaching this as a full-on lesson, you would be researching your own animal. But I love Bill Bryson and I love this passage. So let's have some fun. So you're not doing this on our view only document here. You've made your own copy and you're kind of playing along. So Bill Bryson says, so in contrast to this kind of dry, unlike grizzly bears, black bears are usually shy and seldom aggressive towards humans unless feeling threatened. So we would have read all that. All right. If I were to be pawed and chewed, and this seemed to me entirely possible the more I read, it would be by a black bear, Ursus americanus. There are at least 500,000 black bears in North America, possibly as many as 700,000. They are notably common in the hills along the Appalachian Trail. Indeed, they often use the trail for convenience, and their numbers are growing. Grizzlies, by contrast, number no more than 35,000 in the whole of North America and just 1,000 in the mainland United States, principally in and around Yellowstone National Park. Of the two species, black bears are generally smaller, though this is a decidedly relative condition. A male black bear can still weigh up to 650 pounds and unquestionably more retiring. So even in that first paragraph, I probably would have done some highlighting right around there. Black bears rarely attack, but here's the thing. Sometimes they do. All black bears are agile, cunning, and immensely strong, and they are always hungry. If they want to kill you and eat you, they can, and pretty much whenever they want. This doesn't happen often, but, and here's is the absolutely salient point, once would be enough. Herrero is at pains to stress that black bear attacks are infrequent. This is an author he referenced above. Black bear attacks are relatively infrequent relative to their numbers. For 1900 to 1980, he found just 23 confirmed black bear killings of humans, about half the number of killings by grizzlies, and most of these were out western Canada. In New Hampshire, there has not been an unprovoked fatal attack on a human by a bear since 1784, and in Vermont, there has never been one. And again, so you'd kind of have them go through and highlight. So I'm curious, we have a moment if anybody saw or heard something in Bill Bryson's short little passage here. What did you think was particularly interesting or compelling, or what would you have commented on as a reader? Yep, definitely. I like how he blends the facts and humor, Becky, and Carrie saying bits of humor, keeping the reader engaged. I like how he kind of uses that little bit of wit. Sometimes it is, oh, they could do it, whenever they want, or it only takes once to die by a black bear. But, he's got those pieces, but then he also, really does talk about some of the facts too. And he talks about how many are there, minimum, maximums. He compares them to grizzlies. Yeah, lots of fun word choices in there. It is definitely, there's some imagery here. Like I can imagine walking on the Appalachian Trail and then for convenience, oh, there's a bear strolling along the trail, right? Like, oh, he wasn't in the woods, he was on the trail. Yeah, yep. And he talks, yep. And he's located in New England when he's writing this, so which is why he's talking about New Hampshire and Vermont. Yep. Awesome. Yeah, the parentheticals. Yes, Lori, yeah, I love how he uses the punctuation, right? He really strategically incorporates the parentheticals and the dashes there. Yep, being pawed and chewed, that kind of rolls off the tongue. Yeah, which is a little bit different than, right? Oh, if they're feeling threatened, if you encounter, stay calm and do not run, blah, 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 blah. We have the Charlie Brown kind of teacher version of the nonfiction up here. And not that it's not valuable. And we do need our students to be able to learn how to write in this more kind of just the facts manner, but the fun stuff comes down here. So here's the next move. And again, you might have just a little bit of time to play with this in your segment below, but then you have them go back and you have them really analyze those sentence structures and say, okay, well, let's look back at this first one. If you were to be pawed and chewed, and this seemed to be entirely possible the more I read, it would be by a black bear, Ursus americanus, right? And then I forgot the extra little line there. So if you were to be stabbed and stung, and this seemed to me to be entirely possible the more I read, it would be by such and such kind of bee, the such and such Latin name, right? There are at least such and such number of black bears or bees in the United States, and possibly as many as such and such, which is interesting given that we know the population of bees is lowering. That could then add on to the next sentence right here. This is important to note because, so they could add that right there. And then, this is the fun one. I love this. Black bears rarely attack, but here's the thing. Sometimes they do. So you could take that, bees rarely sting, but here's the thing. Sometimes they do. Jellyfish rarely sting, but here's the thing. Sometimes they do. So whatever animal they're using, they could then fill in kind of in a Mad Lib style and add a little bit of humor here. So I want to pause. I know we're coming close to the end of our webinar time. So just to see what reactions and thoughts, if anybody has a kind of a quick reaction to this lesson and thinking about how you might use it, I'd be curious to hear your comments at this point.
Troy, I don't know if you remember, what was the round goby? That's what it was. I remember we did this with the round goby the one year, and the stories that came out of the nonfiction part of the round goby in Lake Michigan, we had some phenomenal stories because Troy had used the Bill Bryson piece with it. So and students do really like this lesson a lot because it puts it into more of that that piece that I don't know, for me it's like some of the students just better understand informational text if it's put into a story.
Yeah, it was fun. Yeah, someone got really into that idea of invasive species and kind of made this whole like conquest story, like the round gobies, or look how innocent they look, but really they're these vicious monsters. It was a lot of fun. Other thoughts about that? Just what you see, if anyone would like to take the mic. All right, well, being mindful of the time. Oops, I just heard a click. I'll stop talking.
Oh, Troy, I was just going to say, I really appreciate the scaffolding that you put into that lesson because it does take the students from a very basic understanding of informational text to a much more advanced understanding.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, kind of recognizing where we're at with time and knowing that we'll hang out for a few minutes afterwards if anybody has questions, I am going to pull up our final kind of quote, thinking about how we move to these new frontiers of science and writing. We close the book then by, again, articulating this idea that we ask, we explore, and we write. Ask, explore, write. That really became the mantra that we used as we wrote every part of the book, and we hope that that theme is infused throughout. And so we're hoping that by doing that, that will help your students move to be writers now and in the future. Our contact info is here. And I also am going to add one more slide. I'm going to steal it from one of our other slide decks. We do have at least 4 of our programs that we are announcing for this summer. And they are now open and available, and you can register for them. And if you are an attendee of one of our webinars, I am going to drop a secret code here in the chat so you can join right now. If you sign up right now, you too can save a few bucks off of your registration. And if you're watching later, I'm sorry you weren't here tonight, but maybe if you reach out to me and send me an email, I will be kind enough to zip you along a coupon code. But this is kind of a special deal for anybody who's here tonight. I think we appreciate you having taking the time out, and that many of you have been here for multiple webinars. So there's the coupon code in the chat. I'm going to grab that slide and put it in the slide deck so people have it for later. But I think at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Becky and Jeremy to bring us to a close.
Yeah.
Before we go, I do want to recognize Karen had a question. She says life science and biology lend themselves well to this type of literature. Wondering if anybody knows of things that would work for chemistry or physics content.
Good question. I honestly don't know off the top of my head. I don't have specific ideas, but I'd be happy to follow up and talk with you about it if you want to touch base. I could probably brainstorm some things. If you share some ideas, I'd be happy to talk with you a little bit more.
And I was going to share with you real quick. I'm going to put in a link in the chat that is dealing with the writer's, the science notebook. And I'm not, out of respect for my students, because I haven't asked permission to share their work, I'm going to not share student work. But Troy, if I could share my screen again real quick so that I could show you what the actual notebook looks like. I'm going to go through it real quick. I know that we are pressed for time here, but I do want to show this particular notebook, and you can make a copy of this, but I'm just going to go through real quick. This would be the cover. On the inside is the table of contents, and all you do is you send this out to students and they can make their own copy of it. And then you can see there's directions in here, how to be interactive with this notebook for science and making it more interactive. There's all sorts of directions, and there's different links here that you could have students put into their notebook if there's certain tools that you use. This talks about the different shortcuts you could use. There's just lots of different things in here in terms of what you could have your students do. This could be one of your table of contents kind of divider in your notebook. And then they could go into the different tabs for this. But you can see how the notebook is set up and how students could potentially write on it, or how you would have it set up in your classroom. So like I said, out of just respect for my students, because I haven't talked to them about sharing any of their work, but this is the general template, and I gave you that link in the chat, and you can definitely make your own copy, and you can go from there. So hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Yep.
All right, Becky, any closing words as we we'll hang out for the post show and off camera or off recording if people don't want to be captured for posterity. We'll hang out for a few minutes though. Any closing words though, Becky? We'll turn it back to you.
I'm astounded, and so are the people in the chat. You're getting lots of love in the chat. Everybody's talking about the creative ideas this gave them, especially with the creative nonfiction for things after AP tests. And some of them are very excited about this digital notebook template. So you guys are getting lots of love. So thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your wealth of knowledge this evening.
Thank you.